Hi there, I'm back. So we are now going to be looking at the Indigenous Contribution and Perspective, Steve Talbot's chapter. We had an opportunity to look at the first 7 pages of the reading, and we are now going to hop into looking at, in a little bit more depth, some of the ideas that Talbot shares in his research. Starts with hidden heritage on page 7, first column. In most conventional historical accounts, it is assumed that our modern economic system of capitalism was entirely the product of European ingenuity that ushered in the Industrial Revolution. When the economic system of capitalism arose in England during the 18th century, its first form was mercantile, or trade capitalism. The English colonies in North America, including the religious pilgrims, were organized as joint stock companies. This stage was followed by industrial capitalism with its factory system of production, and finally, in the 20th century, by monopoly capitalism. One may ask, why did capitalism arise in Europe and not in some other continent or geographic place? After all, there are a number of civilizations in the world that had pre-capitalist conditions, such as the advanced urban civilizations in Northeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and the Americas, where capitalism might have eventually arisen. I don't quite agree with him. I don't think it could have arisen here, but this is what Talbot said. Europe, after all, was backward, both economically and culturally, until the Crusades of the 12th and 13th centuries. The Crusades opened up the Silk Road to China and the desire for goods and trade with other pre-capitalist centers in the world. Two factors that gave Europe the impetus to move ahead on the capitalist path were its sailing ships and navigation ability to sail out of sight of continental coasts across broad oceans to loot the New World. With gold and silver stolen from the Americas, combined with armies and sailing ships, European nations were then able to dominate and destroy other pre-capitalist centers around the globe and quickly monopolize world trade. Such an immense amount of gold and silver bullion was looted from Central American and Andean civilizations that the European colonial powers, Spain in the first place, were able to bankrupt other non-European trade centers. Now, Weatherford, he quotes, references this a lot, this historian, argues that the rise of money capitalism is linked to the silver looted from the Andes Mountains of South America. Cerro Rico, Rich Hill, is a mountain of silver over 2,000 feet high that has been continuously mined since 1545. In fact, 85% of the silver mined in the Andes Mountains of South America came from Cerro Rico. So this is important for us to understand when we start to look at this, when we start to think about how capitalism really took off and what really was the impetus was really behind all of this. And these couple slides here are for your reference. I'm not going to test you on any of these links, okay? That's just for you to become more familiar about the Cerro Rico. That's a very interesting behind the story, if you will. So the amount of gold looted is estimated at $2.8 billion in contemporary value, okay? So with so much money pouring into Europe, the old system mutated into a true money economy. Silver coin became the economic medium of exchange. Amount of gold and silver tripled, and the output of the Americas was 10 times the output of the rest of the world. And when you really start to think about that, that's unfathomable. It's difficult to conceive. Soon the circulation of gold and silver really begins to shape what starts to happen. It goes from barter and exchange at European trades under the old feudal system, and then it starts to mutate into a new system. Eventually, it ushers in what's today called true capitalism. All right. So in another chapter of Weatherford's book that's quoted, he links the birth of corporations to piracy and slavery. Spain used conquistadors to loot the Americas. The British used pirates and private trading companies. In their quest for gold, the commodity most in demand by the Spaniards soon became slaves. This was because Spain had already killed most of the Indians of the Caribbean and other coastal areas of Spanish America. The British especially turned to piracy. Unable to find a Cerro Rico and other mines in North America, they raided Spanish ships carrying gold and silver bullion. In 1562, John Hawkins, with the patronage of Queen Elizabeth I, became the first English slaver. Hawkins' logo on the bow of his ship was a bust of an African slave in chains. Going on to page 8 here. Working for Hawkins was a young Francis Drake, in command of the slave ship Judith. Drake assembled a syndicate of investors in 1577 to finance a series of raids on Spanish colonies in South America. He plundered 16th century Spanish settlements of present-day Chile, Peru, Central America, and Mexico. It's estimated that his financial backers, who probably included the Queen herself, reaped profits as high as 1,000% on their investment. The Queen gave Drake 10,000 British pounds as his reward and knighted him. Capitalism was born on the twin supports of the African slave trade and the piracy of American silver. Trade eventually replaced piracy for the British when the flow of gold and silver played out a century later. Fur in North America became a commodity. The Hudson Bay Company, the oldest trading company in the world, was chartered by King Charles II in 1670. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a later lecture. Another early trading company was the Northwest Company, and we'll look at that as well. Okay. Other colonizing joint stock companies at the beginning of the 17th century, the forerunner of the modern business corporation, okay, keep that in mind, where the corporations were birthed from, included the New France Company, founded in Montreal, the Virginian Company of London, founded in Jamestown, and later the Dutch West Indies Company, founded in both New Amsterdam and Albany, New York, and the Massachusetts Bay Company. These companies were all founded for profit. As Weatherford explains, eventually these colonizing joint stock companies founded different kinds of plantations throughout the Caribbean and along the North American coast to grow sugarcane, tobacco, indigo, rice, maize, corn, and some cotton. By 1670, okay, when the Hudson Bay Company was formed, all of the important parts of Anglo-North America and the Caribbean had been allotted to one company or another to explore, control, and to exploit. It's rarely mentioned in mainstream literature that the 13 English colonies along the Atlantic seaboard of North America were, in fact, joint stock companies. The Virginia Company first settled Jamestown in search of gold. The Plymouth Company was a joint stock company in which the merchants and other investors of Plymouth, England, subsidized the Pilgrims to produce commodities for profit. The Pilgrim Fathers first left England to settle in Holland, where they found religious freedom but little in the way of economic opportunity. They consequently decided to emigrate to America in search of the profits that had eluded them in the Netherlands. Their first shipment back to Europe contained furs and lumber. Yeah, lumber, all those trees, those forests that were ripped down in the east, it was all forest. Most of the buildings of these areas that were developing over in Europe, a lot of them had lumber from here. That's not mentioned much either. By the start of the 18th century, the financial institutions of the modern capitalist world operated with well-established joint stock companies, extensive banking networks, and even stock exchanges. The entire economic transformation of the world had taken approximately 2 centuries from Columbus's discovery of America. More than 150 years ago, Karl Marx wrote the following assessment of capitalism. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, and the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. And in the Americas, capitalist development was marked by the genocide of tens of millions of indigenous peoples and the destruction of their societies and cultures. So that I think is very important. I want you to understand that. And then the chapter talks about the first ecologists. Well, you know, First Nations, this shouldn't be First Peoples that are here. You shouldn't be surprised by that, right? Ecology is defined in this reading as a science devoted to the interrelationships between organisms and their environments. So, you know, it makes sense. Through their burning practices, their patterns of subsistence, by growing, for instance, corn and beans together to preserve the richness of the soil, by creating various hunting preserves for beaver and other animals, and by developing special religious attitudes, Indians preserved a wilderness ecological balance wheel. Even the intensive farming of the Iroquois, without chemical fertilizers and pesticides, protected the ecology of the northern forests. And you know, this goes on to talk about how a lot of the activists, or the peoples that are speaking out against this destruction today, you know, they have a lot of the concerns because there's been so much destruction. The difference between Indigenous and Euro-American environmental concepts, they write, that to understand the European concept, one must go back to the Christian Bible with its command to subdue the earth and the idea of progress. The idea of progress, however, is foreign to North American cultures, which adopt a cyclical view of time. The Indians' sacred circle of creation, everything, even stone, is equally alive. We've talked about this. The source of the environmental conflict between the indigenous nations and the invading Europeans was ideological. The former saw their environments as the sacred interdependence of the Creator's will, but were confronted by waves of post-Renaissance Europeans who saw in the environment a natural resource ordained by God for their benefit. And this is what was here, page 10. European observers marveled at the natural bounty of America, of Virginia sturgeon 6 to 9 feet long, of Mississippi catfish that weighed more than 100 pounds, of Massachusetts oysters that grew to 9 inches across, as well as lobsters that weighed 20 pounds each, at flights of passenger pigeons that sometimes nearly darkened the sky, and speculated that a squirrel could travel from Maine to New Orleans without touching the ground, and that bison were ranging as far east as Virginia. So, you know, you really start to step back and think, well, what the heck? What happened here? And you know, on page 10 on the second column, starts referencing the impact from the time of Christopher Columbus. They were a peaceful people who made pottery. He was talking about the people that were here when at contact with Christopher Columbus when he landed on the island in the Bahamas, and it was later called San Salvador. He met the Arawak Indians, who were very peaceful. Within a little more than a century, San Salvador had experienced an environmental transformation. The Arawak were gone and were replaced by the Spanish cotton plantations worked by African slaves. By cutting down tropical vegetation and turning fertile land into one-crop agricultural fields, the Spanish planters leached the soil of its nutrients. Eventually, the island became a desert. The island's fertility and the large native population of skillful farmers, estimated to have developed the most productive fields in the world, cassava, beans, maize, and other crops, had been destroyed by the 1580s. So this is, goes on to talk a little bit more about the careful stewardship and interaction, and we've talked about that at length, so I'm not going to go too much into that, but it's just, it's shocking really when you start to study history. So this is what Von Deloria says, and this is the last slide here. And another very insightful read, and I've referenced him already in this class. Eminent Indian scholar Vine Deloya Jr. examined the current religious crisis in contemporary American life and concluded that Christianity had failed both in its theology and in its application to social issues. Rather than maintaining a hold on a religious holding on to a religion imported from Europe, he recommended seeking a new religious commitment. He writes that we must seek God here in the North American landscape and among its first inhabitants, the Indians. We must throw out the Judeo-Christian concept of linear time from creation to apocalypse through exploitation of people and nature, and think in terms of space, relating land, community, and religion into an integrated whole in order to have a proper relationship with other living things. Only by returning to the land can we have an adequate idea of God. That's the reading, and I hope you take time to make good study notes on it, because you will for sure be getting questions on this material. Okay? All right. Talk to you soon. Bye.